My beloved child, the smallest detail was the one he forgot to hide. Not a dramatic confession. Not a sudden announcement. Not even a message that was meant to reach you. It was something far quieter than that, one ordinary detail sitting in the background, unnoticed, waiting for the right person to recognize what it meant. And when that happened, the entire story began to shift. The second party had spent so much time believing that what happened behind closed doors would remain there. He believed silence had protected him. He believed enough time had passed. He believed the people around him had accepted the version of events he had carefully allowed them to see. But there was one thing he misunderstood: truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters a room almost invisibly, through a forgotten sentence, an unusual reaction, a detail that does not match, or a question nobody originally intended to ask. That is why I want you to stay with this carefully, because what was discovered was not simply about him. It quietly explained something you may have been questioning about yourself for far too long. And once you understand that part, you may finally see why certain pieces of this connection never seemed to fit. Strangely, nobody was searching for the truth when it first appeared. That is what makes this different. There was no confrontation planned. Nobody sat down determined to expose anyone. Life was simply moving forward, and a conversation began that seemed completely unrelated to you. His name came up almost casually. Someone remembered something he had said before. Another person responded with a detail of their own. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. Then someone stopped. There was a pause, not because something terrible had been revealed, but because two versions of the same story suddenly did not match. One detail suggested one thing. Another detail suggested something completely different. And the person listening quietly wondered, why would he have said it that way? That single question changed the atmosphere. You know those moments when your intuition notices something before your mind can explain it? This was one of them. Nobody accused him. Nobody rushed to conclusions. They simply began remembering. And memory can become remarkably clear when people finally compare the pieces they have been holding separately. Don't skip this part, because this is where the story stops being about what he concealed and starts becoming about why it mattered. The second party had assumed everyone possessed only fragments. One person knew one detail. Someone else knew another. You knew only what had reached you. As long as those fragments remained separated, his version of events could remain comfortable. But once two people spoke openly, those fragments touched. Then a third detail surfaced. Something he had explained one way weeks earlier had apparently been described differently somewhere else. A decision he had presented as spontaneous now seemed far more deliberate. A conversation he claimed had meant very little appeared to have carried more intention than he admitted. Still, nobody reacted dramatically. Instead, something much more powerful happened. People became quiet enough to observe. And when people stop arguing and start observing, inconsistencies become difficult to overlook. What happened next would have surprised him most. The person connecting these details did not immediately tell anyone what they suspected. They waited. They watched. They allowed the conversation to continue naturally. That patience revealed more than confrontation ever could. Another sentence surfaced. Then another. Suddenly, an earlier moment that had seemed confusing began making sense. Think about that carefully. Have you ever looked back at something and realized your confusion was not because you failed to understand, it was because you never had all the information? That realization can change the way you carry an old memory. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and begin asking a healthier question, "What information was I missing?" Those are very different questions. One turns everything inward. The other allows you to see the situation as it actually was. And somewhere in this unfolding story, that distinction is becoming important for you. Then came the detail nobody expected. It was not evidence of some enormous hidden scandal. It was more personal and believable than that. Someone remembered the exact way the second party had reacted whenever your name entered certain conversations. His words had always sounded casual, yet his behavior told another story. He would change the subject too quickly. He would become unusually interested in what others knew. Sometimes he would dismiss something before anyone had even challenged it. At the time, these reactions seemed meaningless. Looking back, they formed a pattern. And patterns become visible only after enough moments have passed. The person noticing this began wondering why your presence, or even the mention of you, seemed to create such an immediate shift in him. What was he protecting? His reputation? His pride? A decision he regretted? Or simply the fact that he knew more about this connection than he wanted anyone to realize? Here is where the emotional center of the story begins to move. Because the second party's hidden truth was not powerful merely because it had been hidden. It mattered because his choices had quietly influenced the way other people understood you. He had shaped impressions without appearing to do so. A small comment here. A carefully incomplete explanation there. Nothing dramatic enough to raise immediate suspicion, yet enough to create distance and uncertainty. And perhaps that explains why you sometimes felt as though people were responding to a version of you that you did not recognize. You may have wondered why certain conversations felt slightly strange. Why warmth suddenly became hesitation. Why someone who once seemed open became difficult to read. There may have been perfectly ordinary explanations for some of those moments, of course. But within this story, one possibility was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Somebody else had been filling in the blanks before you ever had the opportunity to speak for yourself. A door opened without anyone touching it. Not literally, but emotionally. The person you care about began reconsidering something they had previously accepted. They remembered a conversation with the second party that once seemed harmless. At the time, they had no reason to question it. Now the wording sounded different in memory. Why had he been so certain about something he could not possibly have known? Why had he presented an assumption as though it were a fact? And why had he seemed so invested in keeping two people from understanding each other directly? Those questions did not produce instant answers. They produced something better, curiosity. Because curiosity leaves room for truth. It does not force a conclusion. It simply says, "I need to look again." And that is exactly what began happening. Stay till the end, because the next realization changes the emotional meaning of everything that came before it. The person you love did not immediately become angry with the second party. Their first feeling was disappointment in themselves. They wondered whether they had judged you too quickly. They replayed moments when you had tried to communicate something but perhaps did not have the words. They remembered your silence differently. What they once interpreted as distance now looked more like restraint. What they once saw as indifference could have been uncertainty. And suddenly, one memory returned with unusual clarity, a moment when you could have defended yourself aggressively but chose not to. You could have exposed everything you knew. You could have demanded to be believed. Instead, you stepped back. At the time, they misunderstood that choice. Now they were beginning to recognize something else inside it: dignity. That realization stayed with them longer than they expected. It followed them into the quiet parts of their day. Not because they were trying to romanticize the past, but because they were finally examining it without someone else's interpretation standing between you. They remembered your tone. Your patience. The way you seemed to know more than you were willing to say. Perhaps you were protecting your peace. Perhaps you simply understood that forcing someone to believe you would never create genuine understanding. Whatever the reason, your restraint suddenly carried a different meaning. And while they were processing that, another piece appeared. This one came from the second party himself. Not through confession. Through contradiction. Someone asked him an ordinary question about an earlier situation. He answered quickly. Too quickly. Then, moments later, he added an unnecessary explanation. Nobody challenged him. Yet the explanation created a problem. It contradicted something he had previously said. The person listening noticed immediately. The second party apparently noticed too, because his tone changed. He attempted to soften what he meant. Then he reframed it. But the more he clarified, the clearer the inconsistency became. It was not some cinematic confrontation. It was quieter, and because of that, more revealing. Sometimes people disclose the most when they are trying hardest to make something sound unimportant. Something important is waiting for you here. The person you care about did not need every unanswered question resolved in that instant. They only needed enough clarity to understand that their original picture had been incomplete. That alone changed their perspective. And suddenly, the second party's confidence began working against him. He had been so certain nobody would compare stories that he had never prepared for the possibility that people eventually might. Different explanations had been given at different times because he expected those conversations to remain separate. Now they were no longer separate. The details were sitting beside each other, and the differences were visible. But then something happened that nobody expected. The person you love defended you. Quietly. No dramatic declaration. No public argument. Just one sentence when someone repeated an assumption about you. They said, in essence, that perhaps people had never heard your side properly. That was all. Yet emotionally, it represented an enormous shift. Because for the first time, they were no longer automatically accepting the story they had inherited. They were creating space for your reality to exist beside it. And sometimes one honest sentence can reopen a door that months of explanation could not. The second party heard about that sentence. His reaction was subtle. He asked who had said what. He wanted to know how the subject had come up. He appeared more interested in the conversation than someone with nothing invested in it normally would be. And once again, another person noticed. That was becoming the second party's real problem, not that everyone suddenly knew everything, but that people had started paying attention. His confidence had depended upon nobody looking closely. Now several people were looking closely at once. There is another layer here, and it concerns you more deeply than anything revealed so far. You may have spent time believing that silence meant people had forgotten. That distance meant the connection had lost meaning. That unanswered questions would simply remain unanswered forever. Yet sometimes silence is not an ending. Sometimes it is the period during which people slowly separate what they were told from what they personally experienced. That process cannot be rushed. Genuine realization rarely arrives on command. It develops quietly until one day a person sees something they cannot unsee. And that is what was beginning to happen. The person you love remembered how they actually felt around you before outside opinions complicated everything. Not what somebody told them to feel. Not what seemed sensible afterward. Their own experience. They remembered conversations that felt unusually easy. Moments when you understood something they had not fully explained. Small details you remembered. The calm they felt around you. None of these memories proved some perfect destiny, and they did not need to. Their importance was simpler, those experiences belonged to them. Nobody else could rewrite them. For the first time in a long while, they trusted their own memory. That frightened nobody. But it unsettled the second party. Because his influence depended upon interpretation. If the person you love began trusting what they personally witnessed, his version would matter less. He could explain. He could minimize. He could say something had been misunderstood. But he could not erase another person's lived experience. Then the story took one final turn. Someone found an old conversation. Not a secret recording. Not stolen information. Simply an earlier exchange that had been forgotten until now. Inside it was a sentence from the second party that appeared completely harmless when originally written. But with everything now understood, that sentence carried another meaning. It suggested he had known something much earlier than he later claimed. And suddenly the question was no longer merely, why did he say different things? The question became, how long did he know? That question landed differently. The person you love went quiet. Because if the timeline meant what it seemed to mean, then one of the most important choices made during this entire situation may have been influenced by information the second party intentionally kept to himself. And there was one person who could confirm whether that timeline was correct. Someone nobody had thought to ask. Someone who had been present near the beginning. Someone who remembered exactly what was said. The second party thought the story had disappeared into the past. He was wrong. Because that person had just decided it was finally time to speak. Nobody expected the next truth to arrive in such a calm voice. There was no dramatic entrance, no accusation, no attempt to embarrass anyone. The person who had been present near the beginning simply remembered what happened, and when they finally spoke, the first thing they said made everyone listening reconsider the timeline. That isn't how I remember it. 5 quiet words, yet they changed the direction of the entire conversation. The person you love leaned closer, not because they wanted drama, but because something inside them recognized that this might finally explain the missing piece. The second party had always spoken as though he learned certain things much later. According to this person, that was not true. He had known earlier. Much earlier. And if that memory was accurate, then several choices he made afterward could no longer be understood as innocent misunderstandings. They had to be looked at again. Don't skip this, because the discovery itself was only the surface. What mattered was what he apparently chose to do after learning the truth. A forgotten afternoon suddenly became important. The witness remembered being in the same place when your name first entered the conversation. Nothing unusual happened initially. Someone mentioned you. Another person asked a question. Then the second party became noticeably attentive. He wanted details. He asked how serious the connection was, whether you were still communicating, and what the person you loved genuinely thought about you. At the time, those questions sounded like curiosity. Nobody attached meaning to them. But now, with everything that followed, they looked different. Why had he needed to know so much? More importantly, why had he later behaved as though he barely understood what was happening between you? The witness paused before answering that question. They did not want to exaggerate what they remembered. They carefully separated what they knew from what they merely suspected. And that honesty made their next statement even harder to dismiss. The second party had understood that your connection mattered before he began presenting it as though it meant very little. The room became quieter after that. The person you loved did not immediately respond. Their mind had gone somewhere else, to a specific period when everything between you began changing. They remembered how quickly uncertainty entered the connection. One day things felt natural. Later, everything seemed filtered through questions neither of you had originally created. Perhaps you remember that emotional shift too. There are times when two people do not necessarily lose their connection. They simply stop experiencing it directly. Opinions arrive. Interpretations multiply. Someone says, maybe they meant this. Someone else says, I heard something different. Soon, two people who once understood each other are responding not to each other, but to stories surrounding each other. That is where confusion grows. And now the person you love was beginning to wonder whether some of that confusion had been encouraged. Then came a realization nobody could manufacture. The witness remembered something the second party said shortly after learning how meaningful your connection had become. It was not openly cruel. In fact, that was precisely why nobody noticed it at the time. He suggested that the person you love should be careful about reading too much into your actions. A reasonable sentence on the surface. But then he began supplying interpretations. If you became quiet, perhaps you were losing interest. If you needed space, perhaps you were moving on. If you did not immediately explain yourself, perhaps you were hiding your intentions. Each suggestion sounded possible when heard alone. Together, however, they created a lens through which everything you did could be misunderstood. And once someone begins viewing another person through suspicion, even innocent behavior can appear complicated. Something unexpected happened inside the person you love when they heard this. They did not become consumed with anger toward the second party. Instead, they felt a quiet sadness about how easily uncertainty had been allowed to grow between you. They remembered moments when they could simply have asked you what you meant. They could have trusted the connection enough to communicate directly. Instead, sometimes they had allowed assumptions to answer questions that should have been answered by you. That realization was uncomfortable, but it was also freeing. Because recognizing an old mistake does not require living inside it forever. Sometimes maturity begins with saying, should have asked. And somewhere in that realization, your silence started making sense again. You had probably noticed the change. You may not have known where it came from, but you could feel it. Questions became strangely indirect. Warmth occasionally turned into hesitation. Things that once felt effortless required explanations. Perhaps you tried to understand what had shifted, but nothing obvious presented itself. That is what made the experience confusing. There was no single moment you could point toward and say, there. That is where everything changed. Instead, distance appeared gradually. And when distance grows gradually, people often blame themselves because there is no visible cause. But you were never supposed to carry every unanswered question as evidence against yourself. That was becoming one of the deepest lessons inside this unfolding truth. The person you love began separating your actual behavior from the interpretations they had attached to it. They remembered that when you became quiet, you were often processing something rather than abandoning them. When you stepped away from unnecessary tension, it was not necessarily indifference, sometimes it was self-respect. When you did not compete for attention, perhaps it was because genuine affection should never require someone to audition for a place in another person's heart. These were not grand revelations. They were ordinary human truths. Yet ordinary truths can become extraordinary when they arrive after months of misunderstanding. The witness had not finished. There was another conversation. This one happened later, after the distance between you had already begun. The witness remembered asking the second party whether you and the person you love had spoken directly about what was happening. His response seemed unimportant then. He had said something suggesting there was no reason for such a conversation because the situation was already clear. Now everyone paused over those words. Already clear to whom? Not to you. Not to the person you love. Perhaps not even to the people around you. Yet somehow the second party had positioned himself as though he understood the conclusion before the two people actually involved had reached one themselves. That changed something. Stay till the end, because the next detail was the one that made the person you love stop defending the old version of events entirely. They asked the witness a simple question: did he ever tell you where he was getting his information about them? The witness thought carefully. Then they shook their head. No. Most of the second party's statements had not been presented as things you actually said. They were interpretations. Assumptions. Predictions. He would say things like, "I think they probably," or, "It looks like they might," but over time, those possibilities had somehow begun being remembered as facts. That is how misunderstandings can become powerful. A suggestion gets repeated. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity starts feeling like certainty. Eventually nobody remembers where the original idea came from. The person you love understood immediately. They had not been lied to in one enormous moment. They had been influenced by a collection of small uncertainties. And that was harder to notice. The second party had not needed to invent some unbelievable story. He only needed to keep offering interpretations whenever uncertainty appeared. If your message was delayed, he had an explanation. If you seemed distant, he had another. If you were warm again, he could call it inconsistency. There was always another interpretation available. Yet there was one solution he rarely encouraged. Asking you directly. Why? That question hung in the air. No one rushed to answer it. Then someone said something that shifted the entire emotional balance. Maybe he was afraid of what would happen if they actually talked. Silence. Not because everyone automatically believed it, but because suddenly the possibility explained something. If direct communication between you and the person you love could resolve the confusion, then anyone benefiting from that confusion would naturally lose influence the moment you spoke honestly. The person you love looked away. A memory had returned. There had been one occasion when they nearly reached out to you. They had written something, reconsidered it, then decided not to send it after speaking with the second party. They remembered the conversation now. He had told them that contacting you might make things more complicated. He suggested waiting. Giving you space. Letting you make the first move. At the time, it sounded mature. But what if you had been doing exactly the same thing? Waiting. Giving them space. Hoping they would make the first move. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same silence, each believing the other had chosen it. That realization hit differently. For perhaps the first time, the person you love considered that the distance between you might not have represented rejection at all. It may simply have been prolonged by two people responding carefully to incomplete information. And something softened inside them. Not desperation. Not fantasy. Understanding. Because there is a difference between wanting to return to the past and wanting to understand it accurately. They were not trying to pretend everything had been perfect. They knew both of you had made choices. Both of you had misunderstood moments. Both of you could have communicated differently. But now they were finally seeing the situation without placing every responsibility on you. And that mattered. The second party still did not know how much had been discussed. He believed the old conversation had ended. He continued behaving normally, unaware that the person you love had begun asking questions privately. Not accusations. Questions. They wanted to understand when certain things had been said and who had originally said them. And with every answer, something interesting happened. Your name became less associated with confusion and more associated with unanswered context. Then another person entered the story. Someone who had once spoken directly with you. They remembered you saying something during the period when everything became uncertain. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary sentence. Now it carried enormous emotional weight. You had apparently said that you did not want to force anyone to choose you. Read that feeling again. You did not want to force anyone to choose you. The person you love heard those words and became completely still. Because they had once interpreted your distance as proof that you did not care enough. Now they were hearing that perhaps you cared enough not to manipulate the outcome. That is a very different story. And suddenly they remembered the way you had handled difficult moments. You did not chase every rumor. You did not turn every misunderstanding into conflict. You did not demand that people take sides. Maybe there were moments when you wanted to explain everything, yet you chose to preserve your dignity instead. For the first time, someone else recognized what that restraint may have cost you emotionally. The person you love asked, "Why didn't they tell me?" The answer was gentle. Maybe they thought you had already decided. Another silence. Because that possibility mirrored their own experience perfectly. You thought they had decided. They thought you had decided. And between those two assumptions stood a second party who seemed unusually comfortable with the silence continuing. But the story was still not finished. Far from it. Because the second party eventually sensed the atmosphere had changed. Nothing obvious happened. Nobody confronted him. Yet people stopped accepting his interpretations automatically. When he commented about you, someone asked, "How do you know that?" When he suggested what you were probably thinking, another person responded, "Did they actually say that?" Small questions. Calm questions. Questions he had never needed to answer before. His confidence shifted. He became more careful. And carefulness revealed something. He started correcting details nobody had challenged. He offered explanations nobody had requested. He mentioned that certain conversations had been misunderstood even though nobody had told him those conversations were being discussed. That was when the person you love noticed something extremely important. How did he know which conversation they were questioning? Nobody had told him. Yet somehow he had guessed correctly. Something important is waiting for you here, because this became the moment when suspicion turned into a need for clarity. The person you love no longer wanted second-hand explanations. They did not want another interpretation. They wanted the simplest thing that should perhaps have happened from the beginning. Direct truth. And this time, they knew exactly where to look for it. Not through the second party. Not through friends. Not through assumptions. Through the original conversation itself. There was one message they had never seen in full. A message involving you. The second party had described what it supposedly meant long ago, and everyone had accepted his summary. But somebody still had the complete exchange. And when the person you love finally saw the words for themselves, they noticed something immediately. The message did not say what the second party had always implied. In fact, one sentence near the end suggested almost the opposite. The person you love read it once. Then again. Then a third time. And finally they asked the question that the second party had hoped nobody would ever think to ask. Why was this part left out? The missing sentence was only a few words long, yet it changed the emotional weight of everything around it. The person you love kept looking at the complete exchange, moving slowly between what had actually been written and what they had been told it meant. Nothing in the message was dramatic. That was precisely why the realization felt so genuine. Your words were careful. Measured. There was no rejection hidden inside them, no attempt to close a door, no cold declaration that justified the distance that followed. Instead, near the end, you had left room for understanding. You had made it clear that you did not want confusion to decide what happened next. And somehow, that was the very part that had disappeared when the second party summarized your message to others. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether he had misunderstood you. The question was why the most important context had never been included. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The person holding the original exchange did not try to interpret it for them. They simply allowed the person you love to read. That mattered, because this time there was no voice standing between your words and their understanding. No second party explaining what you really meant. No friend offering an opinion. No assumptions. Just your actual words. And something quietly powerful happened. The person you love began recognizing your voice again. They remembered the way you communicated when things were uncomplicated. Your restraint. Your tendency to choose words carefully when emotions mattered. The message sounded like you. The version they had been given never truly had. How had they missed that? Perhaps because when someone is uncertain, a confident explanation can feel easier than sitting with unanswered questions. But confidence is not the same as accuracy. They understood that now. Then their eyes returned to the missing line. It suggested that if they ever wanted to speak honestly, you would be willing to listen. That was all. No pressure. No demand. No dramatic promise. Just an open door. And suddenly, an old memory came rushing back. There had been a night when the person you love wanted to contact you. They had wondered whether you would even want to hear from them. The second party had discouraged it, suggesting you had already moved forward and probably preferred not to reopen anything. Believing that interpretation, they stayed silent. Now they were looking at a message in which you had essentially said the opposite. That realization did not create anger first. It created stillness. Because sometimes the hardest truth is not discovering that another person influenced a situation. It is realizing how one small piece of missing context might have changed the choices you made yourself. Don't skip this, because what happened next revealed something deeper about the person you love. They refused to turn the second party into a villain simply because new information had surfaced. They wanted facts. They understood that memory can be imperfect, messages can be misunderstood, and people sometimes make mistakes without intending harm. So instead of deciding what happened, they began checking. Calmly. Carefully. They compared the original message with what they remembered being told. They asked one person what they had heard. Then another. And an unmistakable pattern began appearing. The second party had rarely changed your actual words completely. He had done something subtler. He had removed context. He had emphasized uncertainty while minimizing warmth. He had repeated your hesitation but rarely your reasons for it. He had presented your boundaries as distance and your patience as lack of interest. Each change was small enough to seem harmless. Together, however, they created a version of you that you had never created yourself. That distinction became impossible to ignore. And for the person you love, something began healing, not because the past could suddenly be rewritten, but because they were finally able to stop carrying one painful interpretation of it. They had believed your silence meant, "I don't care." Now they could see another possibility. Perhaps your silence had meant, "I care, but I will not force this." They had believed your distance meant, "I am leaving." Now they wondered whether it meant, "I am giving you the freedom to decide." They had believed your lack of confrontation meant you had nothing meaningful to say. Now they understood that sometimes the person who refuses to participate in unnecessary conflict is the person protecting the most meaningful part of themselves. The entire memory changed color. Not into perfection. Into context. And context can be more powerful than any dramatic revelation. Meanwhile, the second party began noticing that people were treating him differently. Nobody became hostile. Nobody excluded him. They simply stopped allowing his certainty to substitute for evidence. When he said, "That's probably what happened," someone would gently ask, "Do we actually know that?" When he interpreted your intentions, somebody would respond, Maybe we should let them speak for themselves. Each question removed a little of the authority he had once carried. Not because everyone suddenly distrusted him, but because they were learning to separate observation from interpretation. He noticed. And his behavior shifted again. One evening, he casually brought up your name without anyone else mentioning you first. That alone caught the person you love's attention. He spoke lightly, almost as if testing the atmosphere. He asked whether anyone had heard from you recently. Nobody answered immediately. Then he added something unexpected. I hope nobody is making this into something bigger than it was. Nobody had said they were. The sentence hung there. Why would he say that? The person you love did not challenge him. They simply watched. The second party continued. He said everyone had probably misunderstood each other. He suggested old conversations should remain in the past. He mentioned that people sometimes remember things differently. All reasonable statements. Yet there was something strange about the timing. He was defending himself against an accusation nobody had made. The person you love realized this too. They asked one calm question. Which conversation are you talking about? The second party paused. Only briefly. But long enough. He named the exact conversation containing the missing sentence. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because nobody had told him they had found the complete message. Nobody had told him which exchange they were reviewing. Nobody had even told him that questions were being asked. Yet he somehow knew precisely where attention had landed. The person you love did not react dramatically. They simply said, interesting. One word. The second party tried to move forward, explaining that he was only guessing. Perhaps he had heard someone mention something. Perhaps he was confusing it with another conversation. His explanations were possible. Nobody dismissed them outright. But something had changed permanently. People were no longer filling gaps in his favor automatically. They were simply observing. And the person you love was observing most carefully of all. Later, alone, they returned to the original message again. This time they stopped analyzing the second party and started thinking about you. That was when the emotional truth finally arrived. All this time, they had been asking whether you still cared. But perhaps that had never been the most important question. Maybe the question was whether either of you had ever been given a fair opportunity to understand what the other person actually felt. That thought stayed with them. They remembered the beginning. Before everything became complicated. Before other voices entered. There had been a natural honesty between you. Neither of you needed elaborate explanations. A glance could soften a difficult moment. A simple conversation could last longer than expected. There was ease there. Not perfection. Not fantasy. Just ease. Then somewhere along the way, both of you became cautious. And caution created empty spaces. Other people filled them. The person you love finally saw how that happened. They also recognized their own responsibility. They could have asked you directly. They could have trusted what they knew of you instead of allowing uncertainty to become certainty. That realization was important because it kept the discovery grounded. This was not a story where one person controlled everything. Human relationships are more complicated than that. Everyone makes choices. Everyone interprets. Everyone sometimes allows fear of awkwardness to replace a necessary conversation. But the second party had still made choices of his own. And one of those choices was about to become impossible to explain away. Stay till the end, because this is where the timeline revealed something nobody had noticed before. Someone compared the date of your original message with the date of another conversation involving the second party. The difference was less than a day. In the first exchange, your actual words were available. In the second, he told the person you love that you had essentially closed the door. Less than a day. There had not been weeks for memory to blur. There had not been months for details to become confused. The two conversations happened almost back to back. The person you love stared at the dates. Then at your message. Then back at the dates. For the first time, they allowed themselves to consider a difficult but reasonable possibility: the missing context may not have been forgotten. It may have been omitted. Nobody could know his intention yet. And the person you love refused to pretend they did. But now they needed an explanation. So they decided to ask him. Not in front of everyone. Not aggressively. Privately. Calmly. The conversation happened sooner than expected. The second party entered believing they were going to discuss something completely unrelated. The person you love allowed the ordinary conversation to continue for a while. They did not rush. Then, when the moment felt right, they placed the old exchange in front of him. His eyes moved across the screen. His expression changed. Only slightly. But enough. The person you love asked, "Do you remember this?" He said yes. Then came the question. "Why did you tell me they didn't want to speak to me when this says they were willing to?" The second party looked at the message again. He answered that he had interpreted it differently. Fair enough. So the person you love asked him to explain. He said your message sounded hesitant. He believed you were only being polite. He thought contacting you might create more confusion. He insisted that he had been trying to help. For a moment, that explanation seemed possible. Then the person you love asked something else. "If you thought that was what they meant, why didn't you show me the whole message?" Another pause. The second party said he could not remember. Maybe he had summarized it quickly. Maybe he assumed the details were unnecessary. Maybe he genuinely believed his interpretation was accurate. The person you love listened without interrupting. And then they asked the question that changed his expression completely. "Were you hoping we wouldn't talk?" The second party looked away. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "I thought talking would make everything harder." The person you love remained calm. Harder for who? Silence. That question reached somewhere the others had not. Because if his only concern had been protecting them from confusion, the answer should have been simple. Instead, he hesitated. Then something unexpected happened. The second party stopped explaining. His shoulders relaxed. His tone became quieter. And for the first time since the truth began unfolding, he said something that sounded less like defense and more like honesty. He admitted that he had been afraid. Not of you. Not of some terrible outcome. He had been afraid of becoming irrelevant. That admission changed the entire emotional atmosphere. The person you love did not expect it. Neither would you. Because beneath all the confusing explanations, there was something painfully ordinary: insecurity. The second party had become accustomed to being the person others came to for advice. He liked being needed. He liked feeling important. And as your connection grew stronger, he sensed that his role might change. If you and the person you love began communicating openly, they would no longer need him to interpret things between you. He did not describe it as a plan. He said it happened gradually. One suggestion. One opinion. One moment when he chose not to share the full context. Then another. Each time, he told himself he was helping. Until eventually he could no longer clearly separate helping from protecting his own position. The person you love listened. There was disappointment, yes. But there was also understanding. Because insecurity does not make someone beyond redemption. It makes them human. What matters is what they choose once they recognize it. The second party looked down and said quietly, "I didn't think anyone would ever compare everything." There it was. The sentence that finally aligned with the title of this entire story. He thought nobody would find out. He was wrong. But what happened next was not punishment. It was something far more meaningful. The person you love told him that the hardest part was not that he had opinions. Everyone has opinions. The hardest part was that he allowed those opinions to become substitutes for conversations you and the person you love should have had directly. The second party nodded. No argument. No clever explanation. Just recognition. Then the person you love asked one final question. "Is there anything else you didn't tell me?" His face changed again. And this time, the silence lasted much longer. Because there was one more thing. Something he had kept separate from every conversation until now. Something involving a moment when you had apparently tried to reach the person you love much earlier than they ever realized. The second party took a slow breath. Then he said, "There was another message." The person you love stared at him. What message? And when he explained when it had been sent, they immediately understood why everything between you had changed shortly afterward. Because that message had arrived on the exact day they had been waiting to hear from you. And they had never seen it.